I'm very, very excited about our next keynote, which is called Leadership in 2018, how managers can lead inclusively in times of volatility, with Michelle Kim, who is the co-founder and CEO of Awaken. Michelle is awesome. She's a new friend of mine. She's wonderful. She's a fierce entrepreneur who's challenging the status quo in tech. She's the CEO of Awaken, which is a leading provider of experiential workshops that empower managers and teams to lead inclusively. Michelle was named a top writer in diversity by Medium. She's a contributor to Courts at Work. She used to work in change management in tech and for Fortune 500 companies, and she is a lifelong social justice advocate, and she has represented organizations like the LGBTQ Speakers Bureau, the SF Human Rights Commission Advisory Committee, and Lyric's nonprofit board of directors. And she also is a graduate from UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business. So please give a warm, let's pump it up, maybe standing ovation style. Welcome to Michelle Kim.
Y'all don't have to stand. Thank you. I wish Smiley could introduce me everywhere I go. Hi, everybody. Hi. How are y'all feeling? I saw Oreos on the floor. People are lying on the chairs, taking pictures, taking bathroom selfies. I think we're having a good time, yeah? Yeah. Okay, awesome. So my name's Michelle Kim. The picture is too big because we're excited. I call myself co-founder and head queen at Awaken. And we exist for this purpose. We exist to create compassionate space for uncomfortable conversations in order to develop leaders and teams that are inclusive. We've had the privilege of working with a lot of different companies, and we go in to hold space, hold the container for people to ask the tough questions about diversity and inclusion that people are too afraid to ask, to practice and struggle together, getting messy, so that we can learn all together to be inclusive in the modern times. So how many of you have actually heard this phrase, people leave their managers, not their jobs? Yeah, and how many of you can actually speak to that experience? Yeah, probably a lot of us, unfortunately. So, what I keep witnessing in the work that I do around diversity, inclusion, and equity is that, there are a lot of companies out there that are putting out really fancy marketing slogans about recruiting top talent from diverse backgrounds, to creating an inclusive workplace culture where everybody can be who they are. And yet, when we peel back the layers and look at how the managers actually lead their teams, there's a lot of gap. And what I find is that unless you have a really kick-ass manager, no matter what the company stands for, you're not going to actually benefit from the actual inclusive culture that you need to perform at a high level for your team. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. I'm going to be sharing a little bit of stats to start us off with. I don't think that I need to reinforce the importance of the role of the manager because we've lived it and we have all of our lived experiences to back this up. But they say that 70% of the variance in employee engagement scores actually depend on the managers. And more so, 93% of employees say that their trust in their direct boss is critical in their job satisfaction. So things got a little bit more trickier, as if the stake wasn't high enough. Since the 2016 presidential election, a lot of tension has been building inside and outside of the companies. 2017 was an interesting year. We saw lots of groups of people mobilized for various causes that are both political, some people would argue there are moral grounds, around the Women's March, the Time's Up movement, the hashtag #MeToo, what happened in Charlottesville, the Muslim ban that recently got approved by the Supreme Court. And we thought that we were going to be able to slow down a little bit maybe in 2018, but that's not the case. This year alone, we've experienced even more tension rising. We saw families being separated at the border. We saw people being targeted because of their race. We saw mass school shootings over and over again. And we also saw some high-profile suicides that felt too close to heart for many of us. So when these events occur, I get questions from leaders of companies that are scrambling to figure out, what do we do? Do we say something? Do we not? From managers, do we acknowledge this or do we not? Is this too political for us to get involved? Are we taking sides? Should we, potentially alienate people by talking about some of these issues? What does it mean to be inclusive during times like this? These are hard questions, and I don't know if I have the right answer for you, but I am here to share a few tips that have worked well in some of the companies that I've been inside. So in terms of how this is impacting the workplace, and I think we can really feel some of the impact of the tension that's rising. But the number one thing that I'm seeing over and over again in the market is that the boundaries between the workplace and the politics space are blurring. The personal, professional, and political, they're starting to blur. We see more and more companies taking a stance. The CEO of AT&T actually uttered the words "Black Lives Matter." And more companies are being urged to take a stand on these critical issues that are impacting the people inside these companies. And the tension is rising inside the workplace as well. Employees are demanding that the leaders take a stand, and employees are actually watching how their managers react to some of these issues. People are also learning that diversity itself is not actually leading to inclusion, or that those two things are not the same thing. I say diversity without inclusion is actually purely tokenism. That if we cannot guarantee people in the companies to actually function and actually have a fighting chance at doing their actual best job, then what's the diversity for? And we're also seeing that this lack of inclusion inside the workplaces are leading to turnover of a lot of underrepresented workers that were recruited to join the companies. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Kapor Center, but they put out a really interesting report last year around the tech leavers. Why do women and people of color leave tech? And they found that the number one reason is related to unfairness. And they also cite that more than half of Black women and Latinas actually experience being misread as an administrative staff or janitors inside tech companies. And so with everything rising like this and the tension continuing to rise, we see that right now, in today's time, being an inclusive leader is actually a business requirement. So if I were to put some numbers around this, just so that you're not just taking my word for it, we actually saw that 87% of employees are distracted reading political social media posts during the day. How many of you have done that? Okay. 52% of organizations indicated greater political volatility, and 46% report worsening workplace relationships since the 2016 presidential election. And lastly, and maybe perhaps most alarmingly, 69% of managers report feeling uncomfortable communicating with employees in general. Does that surprise you? Yeah? How many of you are managers in this room? Okay, I see vast majority of us are actually in positions of power where we're leading teams. So, if it's not clear already, I argue, and I think a lot of you would believe, that being an inclusive manager makes you a great manager. In today's time, in this modern times, being a modern manager means that you're also able to lead inclusively in a way that makes everybody on your team feel that they belong and they are included in their workplace. So what can we actually do about it? How can you be an inclusive leader? And I wish I can give you a checklist, but I can't. Because truly, creating an inclusive culture, whether as a manager or as a team member or as an executive, it's a journey. And so at Awaken, we talk about this incremental awakening framework where, in order for us to actually create organizational and institutional and further systemic change, we actually need to start with people themselves. And it's actually not the easy way, right? Or it's actually the most difficult way is to create change within ourselves first. And that's where we get the most resistance. Well, why can't we just put out a recruiting policy that changes things? That's important, but if people actually don't understand why that's needed, that change is not going to stick. So when organizations are pumping out marketing slogans about inclusion and diversity, but none of their leaders have actually done the work themselves, those marketing slogans start to ring hollow to their employees and the consumers themselves. Thank you. And feel free to snap. I'm a big affirmation person. We do this during workshops. Yes, snapping, hollering. Yes, let's make this interactive. So I'm going to give you 3 tips. What can we do as managers or as people who are leading or in positions to lead in varying degrees of influence? What can we actually do? There are 3 tips. Number 1, see people, not just workers. What does that mean? Think of a time when you were on a high visibility project and maybe things weren't going so well. You were trying to figure out, do I speak up? Do I say something? Do I not? Or maybe somebody that you love at home is sick and you're in the meeting room. Your body's there physically, but your mind's not there. Or think about a time when you were really impacted by what's happening politically. Maybe somebody you love was impacted by some of the policies that are going on outside of the 4 walls of your office. Or maybe you experienced a microaggression in the morning and you're still sort of replaying that scene over and over again in your head, thinking about, how could I have responded better in that moment? All of these scenarios have something in common. We're always doing this mental math every day. Should I say something? Should I not? What's the repercussion of me speaking up in this moment and revealing a little bit more about how I'm feeling right now? If that negative repercussion we perceive to be there is higher than us speaking up, then we're not going to speak up. We're constantly doing this mental math, and we call this the culture of psychological safety. If we don't have a culture of psychological safety, which also translates similarly to inclusion, where we can feel like we can be our whole selves, then we're going to hold back a big part of ourselves. So oftentimes when this happens, what do people do? We do this. I'm okay, I'm a high performer, I can push through this. I'm going to get the work done. I don't want to say anything because I don't want people to doubt my ability to perform. When we really feel like this inside. I can relate to this feeling many times when I experience something traumatic happening in my LGBTQ community, the community that I used to organize within. When the Pulse nightclub shooting happened, that really impacted my emotional well-being and my ability to focus at work. But I didn't feel comfortable saying anything because nobody else was talking about it. So in these moments, when we feel that the repercussion of us speaking up is greater than us holding back, then we're going to hold back. Why do we do this? Because traditionally, we have this notion of work-life balance, right? We talk about that a lot, where we have our personal sphere, and then we have the professional sphere. As managers, what we often focus on are people's tasks, projects, responsibilities. What are they doing at their job, right? What are we working on? What are we actually getting done, the actual work? And then there's our personal self, the identities that we hold, our life history, perhaps passions and hobbies that drive us, but also the painful moments of trauma that have shaped us to be where we are today. And oftentimes we separate those things, and we think that they are separated. But in reality, our workplace looks more like this. Whether we acknowledge or not, there is this natural overlap where all of our personal identities and our passions and our traumas and pains, our sense of belonging, how we perceive other people and how other people perceive us, impact the way that we show up at work. It impacts the way that we interact with each other because our identities are the lenses through which we see the world. And we all have different lenses through which we see the world. So when those things collide, that's going to impact the way that we interact with each other, the way that we bring ourselves to work, and how we set those boundaries of how much of ourselves to bring to the workplace to enable us to do our best work actually depends on how we perceive the rest of the organization behaving around us. So we're always taking cues from other people, especially our managers. What is acceptable? What is the acceptable line of vulnerability we can display until I feel like there is a negative repercussion? So when you look at the dotted lines here, the boundary is set by the employee who decides how much of myself to bring to the workplace, but also that is informed by the boundaries that is set by the team culture, that is largely set by the leaders of the company. So our sort of core argument for starting to practice being more inclusive is actually to start by expanding your scope of concern. So if you're a manager and you were traditionally focusing on that piece of the Venn diagram, the work, the professional circle, maybe start to expand your scope of concern just a little bit to see what else is there, to see the whole person that may be in front of you beyond their identity as a worker. And sometimes we get asked this question, well, okay, but what do personal identities have to do with the workplace, right? I mean, you say this is the lens through which we see the world, but really what does that mean? Why do personal identities even have to be talked about? Well, there's a lot of research and examples that I can show you. I can start with one, which is this concept called micro-inequities. Based on our identities, we experience the workplace differently. Based on people's subtle, unconscious, implicit biases, we assign work differently. Harvard Business Review calls the office housework as work that is important but not valued. Things like administrative work, like taking notes or cleaning up the mugs in the kitchen sink, or something like serving on a D&I committee, or mentoring people. D&I standing for diversity and inclusion, if people didn't know. All those work, that's important but not valued work. That's the work that's important but not necessarily going to get you that promotion. Versus high-profile work is the work that will get you that promotion, high-visibility work that's going to get you to that next level. Studies have shown that women and people of color disproportionately get assigned, or they feel like they have to volunteer because people are expecting them to do the office housework, whereas white men get that high-profile work. Even when there's a project that's done with multiple different types of people with different identities, the credit for doing that high-profile work often goes to white men. We're not intending to do that, but sometimes it just happens because we're not constantly checking the biases that we may have in making some of these core decisions. So there's data that shows all of these things are impacting people disproportionately based on their identities. And I can go through a whole bunch of examples of how identities actually show up in the workplace. Click, 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 click. Hopefully it doesn't freeze. The list goes on, right? From doing little things like assuming somebody is a heterosexual person to having a reimbursement policy that may not be inclusive for everybody with different financial backgrounds, right? So we're always assuming different things. We're assuming what is normal inside our workplaces. We're assuming that people can front the money to get reimbursed. Oh, just put it on your credit card. What do you know about their financial situation? What do you know about their caregiving responsibilities? When we do happy hours, when we do social activities that require physical activities, are we taking into consideration everybody's ability and their needs to accessible spaces or activities? So there are a lot of unsaid things that impact and send messages that are very subtle that help us understand whether we belong in this space or don't. So one idea that I've loved, and we use this during our workshops to practice expanding our scope of concern, is this activity, a super simple check-in exercise that anyone can do. You could do it even if you're not a manager. And this is a really powerful check-in exercise that's been popularized by Stanford Graduate School of Business in their interpersonal dynamics class, also known as the touchy-feely class. And they use this check-in exercise prompt during their T group, their processing groups in small groups. It's very simple, and it goes something like this. If you really knew me right now, you would know that, ... It's such a simple phrasing, but it helps you uncover so much more about this person and the context that they're operating within. So I will model this for you. If you really knew me right now, you would know that I am very cognizant of the time clock. that's counting down really quickly. If you really knew me right now, you would also know that my mom is sitting on the front row, and I've spoken at a lot of different events, but this is her first time seeing me speak. If you really knew me right now, you would also know that I have so much else to cover, and I'm going to speed through the next few slides. And if you really knew me right now, you would know that I am very grateful to be here, and I'm having a full circle, surreal moment because I sat right there last year watching people speak from the audience seat. So what a year can do, right? So now you know. Now you know the broader context that I'm operating in. I've just humanized myself to you all, and I don't even know you, and that took maybe 20 seconds. Try it with your teammates and see how it goes. Tip number 2, lead through tension. And by tension, I'm going to be specifically talking about these political moments that are really starting to become even more tense as time goes by. So I'm going to be talking about addressing some of these questions or feelings that I always get, where people feel like, oh, I feel like I need to say something because this big thing that just happened, but I'm not sure what to say. Or, isn't talking about politics inappropriate? Are we there? Should we be talking about politics? All of these questions. And I just want to provide a few tips where you can actually handle some of these conversations for certain issues that may be impacting people that you work with on a day-to-day basis. So, leading through tension, number 1 is acknowledging what is happening. And it doesn't have to involve problem solving. It doesn't have to involve action planning. It doesn't even have to involve people agreeing on certain policies or processes. But the simple act of acknowledgement goes a long way. When I was impacted by the Pulse nightclub shooting, I wished my manager had come to me and said, hey, I know you've been really active in the LGBTQ community, and I know what happened is really bothering me. How are you feeling? Are you okay? Just a simple acknowledgement can go such a long way. You don't even have to make it about the person you're talking to or make assumptions about how this person might be feeling, but just be authentic in your own self, right? When you say, the recent high-profile suicides have really bothered me in many ways, so I just want to make sure that people on my team are doing okay. If you need to talk, just let me know. Or if you need to take a day off, let me know. Number 2, check in with your team. So you can check in one-on-one or during a team meeting. So use different channels, because I know that there are also people who are remote, and we are making, we make sure that we're not making assumptions about when people are able to engage. So even just an email check-in sometimes could help in terms of, I know there's a lot going on politically, so if people want to have a conversation about XYZ things that just happened, let me know. And it could be you're giving them a choice. You're just simply allowing them to know that there is an option for them to talk and to breathe. Creating an actual space to talk about it. So I've been at multiple companies where they've actually hosted discussion meetings and discussion circles around the #MeToo movement. People just wanted to talk about it and revisit some of the sexual harassment policies that are implemented at their current company. So you can actually create space to have a conversation about it, or you can also have a space for you to take a break from it, right? So when all the things around the Muslim ban was happening, one company and one manager, what they actually did was they just started going to lunch breaks. So instead of having lunch at our desk, let's actually collectively get out so we can all have a collective breath so that we can continue moving forward with the day. This is a big one for managers, because managers, all of you have something that your employees don't, which is the power to redistribute work. And this could be really, really powerful if you collaboratively discuss with your teams on whether or not the work could be or need to be redistributed for that week. Simple things like, I know there's a lot going on right now, and I know particularly our team is impacted by what's going on in the world today. Would it be helpful if we prioritize our work differently this week? Would it be helpful if we just work remotely for the rest of the week? So there are different ways in which that you can collaboratively, and don't just take away people's work, assuming that they can't do it. That's bad. But collaboratively discuss, are there opportunities for us to revisit the way that we're doing work this week, or this month, or just today, that will lessen the emotional and labor burden on people who are really impacted by some of the things that are happening. This is a hard one, developing a formal response as a leadership team. But more and more companies are doing this. More and more CEOs and leaders, especially across tech, are starting to actually put a public stance on certain issues. So if you are not in the position to actually draft something on behalf of your company, perhaps suggest to your leaders to reference some of the other letters that have been published. Hey, have you seen that letter by Mark Benioff talking about the ban on, he wrote a letter to pull out all of their workforce in a state that legalized firing gay employees. So taking a stance like that was really helpful for our team, so I just wanted you to consider doing something like that for XYZ issue. Then lastly, getting support for yourself. This is particularly important if you're a manager and you are yourself impacted by what's going on in the world and in the workplace. So I always say we can't pour from an empty cup, and it's really important that you get self-care and you support yourself so that you can continue to have the room to support others as they need to be supported. And the reminder for all folks out there who have the choice to disengage, that our actual choice, having a choice to disengage from all that is going on in the world, is actually a tremendous amount of privilege that we have, that many people out there cannot afford. If I'm allowed to actually disengage, turn off my phone, I don't want to deal with this because it's too much, that says a lot about the kind of choices that I have. So think about the choices that you have as managers, as people with organizational power, to really think about what it means for you to use your privilege for good. And then the last tip is to actually use that power to level the playing field. People are always looking at managers to take cues on how we should be behaving, how we should be cultivating the team culture. You're setting the norm for how we're allowed to and not allowed to behave in the workplace. So it's critical that you are modeling inclusive behaviors, such as interrupting when you actually observe harmful language, bias, or behavior that's rooted in bias in that moment. Sometimes we don't know what to say. We have all the right intentions, but when somebody cracks that not so funny joke, but everybody's laughing along, we don't have the word to actually intervene. So it's important that we are training ourselves. We are practicing being uncomfortable speaking up, even if that means that you're the only person going against the grain. Because as a manager, people are looking at your behaviors to model after. I have a strategy that I always like to give people. It's a one-word strategy where you just have to practice one word for intervening. So my word is wow. When somebody says something, I just go, wow. Did you just really say that? Or you can say, I didn't really get that joke. Can you explain? If you have to explain a joke, it's not so funny. So there are strategies that you can practice, and it's truly a muscle that you need to develop so that you can intervene in that moment. Listen and amplify underrepresented voices, making sure that in meetings, people are not getting interrupted, making sure that you're validating and affirming people who are bringing up different ideas, giving credit where credit is due, really being conscious about how we're assigning work and making sure that credit is being given to people who actually did that work, and also providing the right opportunities for people who are in the workplace, making sure that you're checking any patterns of work delegation to make sure that everybody's getting equitable opportunities to get promoted and to get that high visibility assignment. Disrupting processes or practices that perpetuate biases. Simple things like if you have an application form that only lists 2 genders, men, women, maybe throw out another one that could capture all the folks that are not conforming to the gender binary. Or, if you can challenge some of the practices that are so common in the workplace, you could be that voice to say, hey, I think we could do something better here. Same thing, challenging norms established for privileged groups. So I won't go into that because I think that was a similar example. And then reducing additional labor burden on marginalized people in the workforce. And a quick example of this is, don't ask your few people of color in the company to educate you on some of the issues that they might be facing. Do your homework, go on Google. There's lots of information out there. And so that you can have some processing groups on your own, so that you can do your own learning. All right, so the 3 tips: see people, not workers. 2, lead through tension. 3, level the playing field. These are all things that you could do as managers who are leading teams with special power and privileges inside the organization. I had the privilege of going into Mission High School earlier this year to give a talk during their career day. And I asked them, what's the advice you have that you'd like to give to adults? What do you want me to translate or transfer over to the groups that I'm going to be speaking to later this year? And one brave soul raised their hand, and he said to me, tell them to move on. I was like, what? What do you mean? And he said, they need to stop being stuck in the past. So I'm going to leave you with that word of wisdom, that we need to move on to start creating new realities. We need to start accepting that we're no longer in the traditional ways of doing things. So in order for us to move our business forward, we need to adapt, we need to learn, and we need to become more inclusive, we need to become more socially conscious in order to move on and stop being stuck in the past. Thank you so much. Thank you. Do we have time for a few questions? Great. I see somebody in the back there.
Hello, name is Helene, and I'm actually from the armed forces, so it's not attribution, but in an environment where there's a bit more indoctrination and there's, a tradition and a mission set, how do you work to include those who might disagree with everything you've said today?
Which, to be fair, I think is most companies, I think. I also had a really interesting conversation yesterday. Table 9, dinner table, where are you at? Yesterday, VIP dinners. Okay, hey. There were people from Texas, and they said, well, Texas culture is we're not even close to being there. I think it's really the differentiation that I think we need to remember is that we're not necessarily arguing for or against certain political issues. I mean, we might be. But really what I'm actually advocating for is that we need to start addressing the fact that some of these things are no longer political. So for some people, the politics, the political is actually the personal, and it actually impacts the people on your team's ability to perform. So when we actually look at it that way and how inclusion and psychological safety at a team performance level is critical to us being able to enable our team to show up as their authentic and high-performing selves, it's actually a very bad business decision to ignore that. I saw another hand over there.
Hi, I was wondering, because I read the same article regarding division of labor within corporate America, but just maybe it's a twofold question. One, when they say mentoring, like in the D&I as a division of labor for people especially women and people of color, what does that mean? Because we tend to want to talk about those issues, but want to feel safe while doing them. And I feel like it's necessarily, we're the spokesperson, but we want to be able to contribute in a way that's effective to the organization. And number two, my question to you is that although, people care about management, but in tech, we see a lot of people of color, especially women, leaving the workforce or leaving the industry sooner rather than being retained. Is there any solutions that you think that could address those issues?
Thank you for that question. So to address your first question, I think there are a couple different answers. One is the fact that when the studies have shown that when women of color or people of color and women speak up in the workplace around biases and inequitable work distribution or practices, there's actually negative repercussions that are bestowed upon them. So I think as a culture, we need to change the way that we handle people who are brave enough to raise concerns. Because right now, data is showing that people who speak up actually face negative repercussions. That's one. Two, in terms of the work that is important but not valued, like mentoring or serving on a D&I committee, doing all the important work that's not going to get you that promotion, one way that we need to solve that is actually making that work legitimate, counting that towards performance reviews, making sure that we're actually assigning credit where credit is due, and making sure that those things are also core to how people get promoted. And then your second question about how do we solve the women and people of color leaving the workforce, specifically around tech, I think I could go on forever. I know also Jennifer Kim, who's an amazing D&I expert and consultant, is sitting right there, so we can talk to you probably offline for a long time about that. But I think we, as an industry, we need to up-level our awareness level around some of the issues that are facing women and people of color in these areas. From how biases play out in the workplace, but also to what are some of the processes that may need to be looked at that are creating institutional changes at systemic levels beyond just awareness. And there are lots of resources that I can point you to. So you can check out our website. You can also check out Project Include, has some fantastic resources. So those are two places that I'd recommend you go. All right, I think we're really over time, right? No, we're good? Okay. Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay, one more, in the back.
Hi, my name is Judy, and I'm just curious how you would apply all of the great insight you've shared for teams that are, say, expanding overseas to different countries, different cultures, and also for, say, international companies that are localizing in the US. Specifically because for some people, they might see this conversation, we are nodding our heads and agreeing, but some people in other countries might be like, this is so American. So how do you contextualize that in an international context?
That's a really fantastic question. I think whenever we talk about inclusion and diversity, it has to be contextualized. So if you're delivering some type of training in another country, make sure that all that content is localized, because some of the stuff that we talk about that are impacting people in the US may not apply in international context. I think there are issues that are still very specific. I can't tell you, this country has everything figured out. In fact, I think when I do work with international offices or international populations, there are very unique equity issues and injustice issues that are very unique to that society. So for example, in Korea, #MeToo has really taken off. So gender equity issues is still a thing that they need to address, same as accessibility and disability issues, as well as sexual orientation related discrimination. So I think that it's not that D&I doesn't apply to other countries, it just applies in a very different way that we need to put on a localized lens for us to be able to address effectively the conversations they're having. All right, thank you. Woo!